I'm very excited to be able to introduce Ed Segal to you. I met Ed approximately a year ago, and he has become a good friend, very supportive, very smart person. And so I consider Ed one of my best friends now. Ed Segal is a crisis management expert and the author of a new book on crisis management called Crisis Ahead: 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies, published by Nicholas Brealey. Rated as the best new book to read about crisis management in 2020 and 2021, and one of the best books on crisis management of all time by bookauthority.com. The advice in Crisis Ahead is based on Segal's 30 years of experience as a crisis management expert, public relations consultant, journalist, CEO of 2 trade organizations, and press secretary for Democratic and Republican members of Congress. He is now a leadership strategy contributor for Forbes, and I'm grateful to say I was quoted in one of his recent articles about burnout, where he covers crisis-related news, topics, and issues. Ed is the former CEO, Government Affairs Director, and Communications Director of the Marin Association of Realtors, and lived for more than a decade in Sebastopol on a 7-acre apple orchard. Today, Edward will share his advice and recommendations on how companies and organizations can prevent, respond, manage, and recover from crisis situations. Please help me welcome Ed Segal.
Good morning, everybody. It's really great to be with you today. I have a lot of ties, formally and informally, with the San Francisco area. As Janice said, I was the CEO of the Marin Association of Realtors for more than a decade, and I've known Betty for years with our work in the California Association of Realtors. And interestingly, my wife, on my wife's side of the family, she has very strong ties to the area. Her maiden name was Coombs, Coombs, and one of her relatives actually founded the city of Napa decades and decades ago. Another of her relatives was a member of the state legislature and had the honor of actually introducing the legislation that led to the creation of the Golden Gate Bridge. So I have a lot of family, a lot of ties, and I really enjoyed my time in San Francisco, living in Sonoma County and working in Marin. But along the way, they actually put me into the Federal Witness Protection Program, and I woke up and I wound up in Washington, D.C. So it's great to be back in Washington, where I have a lot of family ties and a lot of career background. But before I get started today, I want to ask each one of you a very important question. Put yourself in the shoes of the chief executive officer of a major corporation. And how would you handle, as a CEO, how would you handle this crisis? Your company's database has been hacked. You receive a threatening phone call from someone who claims they are now controlling all of your computer files and will not release them unless you pay a $100,000 ransom in Bitcoin. Every day you do not pay, they promise to release a series of embarrassing emails that were written by your staff and board of directors. What would you do? We'll come back to this scenario later and discuss how you would respond to it and the best practices for managing that particular kind of a crisis. But I wrote the book, Crisis Ahead, to help companies, organizations, and entrepreneurs know what to do, when to do it, where to do it, and how to do it, if not when they have a crisis. I've summarized the advice in the book down to 10 basic rules, or what I call the 10 R's of crisis management. And I'll switch to a screen right now. And I want to review briefly with you the 10 R's of crisis management. The first R is risk. The best way to prevent a crisis is to identify the risk triggers that could cause a crisis for your company or your organization. Now, there are some risks such as tornadoes, floods, and other related events that may be more likely in your area. Of course, the Bay Area is prone to fires and droughts and earthquakes, of course, and all kinds of calamities. Other triggers, such as allegations of sexual abuse, sexual harassment, lawsuits, even ransomware attacks, are pretty universal and could happen anywhere, anytime, to any company or organization. The next R is reduce. Once you have identified what these risk factors or triggers are, take the steps that are necessary and prudent to reduce those risks and mitigate them as much as possible. Now, these steps could be as basic as following the common sense advice from your accountant or legal team in order to help prevent fraud or forgery or other obvious crimes. Now, that's the basics. You might want to take the extra step and do more extensive actions and reduction of possible risks by providing appropriate training and retraining to members of your staff. The more they're prepared, they know to identify and lessen risks, that will help you do a much better job in reducing the chance of even having a crisis in the first place. The next R is ready. Have a crisis plan in place and ready to implement when it's needed. Now, because one size does not always fit every company or every organization, or frankly, every crisis, it's really important to have as many different contingency plans as necessary to meet each possible worst case scenario. So when those worst case scenarios become a reality, you'll have a plan in place to deal with it. Now, it's been my experience as a crisis manager, as a crisis trainer, as a CEO, helping other companies and organizations, that not every company is going to have the knowledge, the expertise, or the resources they need in order to deal with a crisis. So that's why it's really important to, as part of being ready for the crisis, is to have access to whether it's legal help, IT, HR, whatever it is, have access to those kinds of consultants, vendors, and experts you're going to need for when you have a crisis. And I know some of you are entrepreneurs, some of you are work with major companies. Whatever size of company you are or work for, don't assume that you have to carry the burden of dealing with a crisis on your shoulders. Reach out and get the help you need to get it done and to get it done right. And part of getting it done right is to have a crisis management team in place before you have the crisis. If you wait until you have a crisis on your doorstep and then you're scrambling to figure out what to do and when to do it and how to do it and who's going to do it, you're really wasting valuable time in addressing the crisis in the first place. If you have the crisis plan in place, then it's a matter of activating it and addressing the crisis according to the provisions of your plan. And if you have that crisis team in place, then you're going to have people you could turn it over and they do the work. They do the heavy lifting and they address the crisis. And of course, they keep you as the CEO or head of the company informed every step of the way. And I know that not every company has a crisis management plan. Barely 50 or 60% of companies in the United States even have a plan. And many of those companies, even if they have a plan, they haven't even updated the plan to make sure it works or to put it in test it, having drills and exercises throughout the year to make sure that their plan will work when it's necessary. So these factors, like having a plan, having your crisis team in place, these are really important parts of the third R, ready. And as a public service to each one of you, I'm happy to make a free crisis management template available to you that you can customize for your company or your organization. No matter how large or small your company is, or what industry is, or where it's located, this template will help you walk through what I've identified as dozens of different pieces of information you need to have before you have a crisis. And because not everything will be known until you have a crisis, you fill in the blanks in different parts of the plan. And as the crisis unfolds, then you'll have more information and more details that you can deal with the crisis. So if you're interested in receiving this free crisis management template, just send me an email at Crisis Ahead. That's the name of the book, Crisis Ahead at gmail.com. And I'll also send you on an occasional basis some information and best practices, focusing in on how well or sometimes how poorly companies and organizations in the news are dealing with a crisis. The next R and the 10 R's of crisis management is to rehearse. If you already have a plan in place, or if you don't have it now, as soon as you do have it in place, then it's really important to review and update the plan on a regular basis to make sure it's still relevant, reflects any late breaking news or possible crisis scenarios it might not have considered before, and hold practice sessions throughout the year to ensure that the plan will work when needed. In my view, having a plan and not practicing it is not much different than having no plan at all. And the more you practice the plan, the more you are ensured that it will work and that your team knows how to implement the plan, then the more prepared you are when you have that crisis. The next R is redundancies. If you have a backup plan it's one thing to have a crisis management plan, but as I said earlier, not every plan is going to cover every situation or every possible crisis. So in addition to having your plan A, your basic plan, go ahead and prepare alternative plans for different worst case scenarios. You really do need a plan B, C, D, and maybe XYZ, just to make sure that your company, your organization is prepared as possible for any crisis that happens to you or your company. The next R is research. Get all the information you can about the crisis, including the details of what happened, what is happening, or what you expect to happen. Knowing the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how is absolutely essential to helping you deal with that crisis. The more you know about the situation, the better prepared you are to deal with it. Now, I know from dealing with crisis situations for others and counseling others on how to respond to a crisis, in a late breaking crisis, you may not have all the information you need or you want to deal with a crisis. So my advice in that case is to do the best you can with the information you can. And as more information becomes available, then you fill in the blanks in your crisis management plan and respond accordingly. But again, the more you know, as soon as you know it, the better job you'll be able to do to understand, address, and seek to resolve and put behind you your crisis. The next R is react. You need to know what is going to trigger that crisis plan and when you are going to put that crisis management team in place. And that's one of the things I address in the book. I've identified dozens and dozens and dozens of triggers that can cause a crisis, whether it's an accident or whether it's forgery or literally an A to Z list of things that could possibly go wrong that you should prepare for. But as I said earlier, some crises are more or less likely going to happen to your company simply because of the nature of the business or your profession. So you really need to have an objective look at your industry that you're in, your company, your line of business, and what could possibly go wrong, and then take those steps to know when they go wrong that you'll immediately um, trigger the implementation of your crisis plan. And when you know you're having a crisis, please don't wait. Don't sit on your hands or say, I just don't know what to do. I should talk to someone. If you have that plan in place, then you'll know exactly what to do. If you have your crisis management plan in place, you'll know exactly who will be able to do it. So responding quickly, strategically, effectively, as soon as you know there's a crisis is absolutely essential. And the whole purpose of having a plan and a team in place is to put the crisis behind you as quickly as possible. You don't want to draw things out. You don't want to prolong the crisis. You want to deal with it, resolve it, solve it, get it behind you, and get back to normal as quickly as possible. The next R in the list of 10 R's of crisis management is to reach out. In any crisis, it's likely that you will need to keep people informed or updated. If you're a publicly traded company, you need to let the public know and members of the company, any stockholders know. If you're privately owned, you need, and you're funded by venture capitalists, you need to keep them posted. Your employees, your vendors, your customers, the public, they will want to know what is happening with your crisis, and you really need to keep them informed and updated through all appropriate means, whether it's a direct message, or whether it's a email, whether it's a phone call, posting information on your website, social media platforms. You really need to keep people informed and updated about your progress in dealing with a crisis, and importantly, when you have solved the crisis and then steps you're taking to put the crisis behind you. Number 9, recover. It's really important when you know the crisis is over to take steps to recover from the crisis. And having a recovery plan is really just as important as having a crisis management and contingency plans. Because unless you have a recovery plan, you're not going to know what to do, who's going to do it, or how to do it. So that's really important part for dealing with a crisis. Now, again, what you need to do to recover from a crisis, a particular crisis, is going to depend on what that crisis is. But at least in a general sense, you should be able to know that if any of these worst case crisis scenarios happens, what are you going to do? How are you going to do it? Who's going to do it? And how are they going to do it? So that's an important part of the 10 R's. And then the final R in the 10 R's of crisis management is to remember. Pay attention to how other companies and organizations or even high profile individuals, how they're responding to a crisis, how they're managing a crisis, how they're recovering from a crisis, and what can you learn from how well or sometimes how poorly they are responding to that crisis. And as Janice mentioned, I am now a regular columnist for Forbes.com. And I write frequently, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, on how well or sometimes how poorly companies and people in the news are managing a crisis. And this last couple of weeks, this month alone, has really provided some important crisis management lessons on what to do, how to do it, why to do it. And by being a continuing education student and paying attention to others in the news and how they're doing, there's a lot we can learn from how others are managing their crisis situations. The Suez Canal crisis, for example, it was only yesterday that they managed to free that gigantic cargo ship in the Suez Canal which had been clogging one of the most important waterways in the world for almost a full week. And the lessons that I observed, that I wrote about in my columns for Forbes, was that you always need to have a plan. You never know what's going to happen that might need your immediate attention and force you to figure out what to do. I will wager a lot of money that no company had any plans for what to do if the Suez Canal was clogged and the goods that they were expecting to be delivered were delayed for days, weeks, sometimes months. So no one had a plan to deal with the Suez Canal crisis, and everyone had to scramble to figure out what to do. Fortunately, the ship was freed, but now everyone's having another crisis. When are they going to get their goods? When are they going to get their products? And how are they going to deal with customers who are expecting those goods and products? I noticed a couple of days ago, before the ship was freed, that the Egyptian government started to come up with their own backup plan in case the excavation and the digging around the ship did not work. And the government was reported by news organizations to actually start considering ways to offload the ship. There was an estimated 20,000 containers on that ship. And if the dredging did not work to free the ship, the Egyptian government was starting to consider alternative contingency plans to actually offload 20,000 containers onto the desert so that the ship would be able to rise enough, refloat, and be able to be resume normal operations. Another lesson to be learned, you might have seen this in the news in the last couple of weeks. General Mills, some people are calling it Shrimpgate. General Mills makes a cereal called the Cinnamon Toast Crunch. And last week, a consumer in Los Angeles claimed he had found not one, but two shrimp tails in a box of cinnamon toast crunch. This put General Mills, who makes the cereal, into a crisis situation. It raised all kinds of issues about the safety of the product, quality control, what was in the box, how did it get in the box. And General Mills made a couple basic mistakes. One, they tried to litigate this crisis on social media in front of the whole world. They actually tried to minimize the crisis, and they really created another crisis by how they were dealing with this particular crisis. Another lesson to be learned from General Mills was that they took their time responding to the crisis, and that's a mistake in any crisis situation. So there's a lot to be learned from how poorly General Mills responded. Many of you might be great fans, as I am, of the great game show, Jeopardy. And Jeopardy, of course, they lost their great beloved host, Alex Trebek, who had been the host of the show for more than 35 years. He actually hosted, as I understand, more than 8,000 episodes of the game show. And the Jeopardy has been in the process for the last couple of weeks, last couple of months, of having celebrity guest hosts. And they'll continue to have guest hosts for several more months until they decide who the permanent replacement is going to be. But Jeopardy created a crisis because one of their celebrity guest hosts is Dr. Oz. And they gave him the opportunity for a 2-week run to host the show. But a lot of people don't like Dr. Oz. Now, he has great fans, but he also has a lot of critics and detractors based primarily, or at least partly, on some of the controversial things he has said and done prior to being the celebrity guest host. This created a crisis for for the show because a lot of people started to call for a boycott. They wanted to protest. They signed a petition. It created a real problem for the show, which has not been resolved yet. And some of the basic lessons to be learned from the Jeopardy crisis is be very careful who you associate with. Do your homework, do your research. Don't do anything that could put your brand for your company or your organization in jeopardy. Another lesson to be learned from Jeopardy is that, as far as I understand it so far, the show has not responded to any of the criticism. And I think as time goes on, that's a real mistake. You really need to get your side of the story out for a crisis as soon as possible. Depending upon what the crisis is, what the allegations are, what the charges might be about your company, if you don't respond quickly, if you don't tell your side of the story, if you don't deny what's being said about you, then people have a tendency to believe it, whatever it is, unless you answer it. So it's really important to have your side of the story out there. The other thing another great lessons to learn from is Governor Andrew Cuomo, who has been in the news, and not in a good way, for two crisis situations. First, of course, there was the news about a month ago that he and his staff had taken steps to hide from the public information about COVID deaths that had occurred at nursing homes throughout New York State. And that raised allegations and accusations of a cover up. What was he hiding? How come he wasn't sharing the truth about the crisis? And the lesson here is, in any crisis situation, facts matter, information matters, and you really need to practice full disclosure to let the public and everyone who's affected by a crisis, that you need to let them know what's happening with the crisis and the full details. If you hold it back, whatever the details are, and it later comes out that you're withholding information, that does not put you or your company in a good light. Charges of cover-ups, hiding the what are you trying to hide. So it's always best to practice full disclosure and to get all the information out as soon as possible about the crisis. The more people know what you're doing and how you're doing it and what the facts are, that will help bolster your credibility and their trust and faith in you, that you and your company know the crisis, know what's happening, and know what has to be done to recover from it. And of course, the governor in the last week or so was found himself into another crisis with a series of allegations made by women on his staff, or women that he had met in various social and political situations, accusing him of inappropriate touching and other allegations. And the lessons to be learned from that crisis is be careful what you say, be careful what you do. Don't assume that what used to be acceptable or tolerated behavior before is accepted or tolerated behavior now. So you have to be very, very careful. And he has his own challenges now in the political front, because there are now charges, requests or demands that he resign. There are talk of having him go under impeachment uh, proceedings in the state legislature. So he has his own, not one, but at least two crises that he is working on right now. And of course, in the news earlier this month was Oprah Winfrey, who interviewed Harry and Meghan. And this created quite a crisis for Buckingham Palace because of the allegations of racism that Harry and Meghan raised in their interview. And this was actually another situation where Buckingham Palace issued a statement, but it was lukewarm, and it really did not address the charges and the allegations of the interview. And that statement from Buckingham Palace was really subject to a lot of criticism and review from the public. So it's really important to get your side out, your side of a crisis out to the public, and to address the charges or the allegations forcefully, immediately, and effectively. And then the final lesson I want to leave you with before we go into Q&A are the lessons to be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. And without getting political, because this has been quite a political issue, I just want to make some general observations from purely from the standpoint of the best practices for managing any crisis. We failed on a lot of fronts. Our biggest, our most obvious failure to me was that we did not learn from our past mistakes. This is not the first pandemic that this country has had to deal with. Almost more than 100 years ago, if you remember your history, we had the 1918 flu pandemic that killed hundreds of thousands of people in the United States and millions around the world. And then just a few decades later, we had the polio epidemic. And after that, decades later, we had the AIDS situation. And now we have COVID-19. And the lessons to be learned from how we did or did not respond to this national public health emergency. First, we did not remember our past. We did not remember the lessons that we should have learned. We did learn at the time, but forgot them as time went by from how we responded to other crisis situations. We did not have the resource. We did not have the expertise. We did not have a plan for dealing with this crisis. And the other thing to remember in dealing with any national emergency or any crisis at all is that you have to make sure before you try to recover from the crisis, you really have to make sure that the crisis is over. And the news reports I saw last night, we may well be into our fourth surge of infections and deaths around the country because some people, some states, some governments, some leaders are not following the science. They're not waiting until the crisis is over. The Dr. Anthony Fauci and other health officials have warned us for months what we have to do in order to deal with this crisis. Social distancing, wearing masks, frequent hand washing, don't congregate in crowds. And dozens of states are actually ignoring this common sense advice. And what do we see? We see that the crisis continues. We see that some of us are actually prolonging the crisis. The sooner we follow the facts, we follow the science, and we all work together to end this crisis, the sooner that crisis will end. And that's another final lesson I wanted to share with you before we go into Q&A. Remember the past, remember what works, avoid what doesn't work, pay very close attention to how well or poorly others are dealing with their own crisis, and what can you learn from their successes or mistakes that you can apply for your own company, your own organization to help manage, prevent, recover from a crisis as soon as possible. And now I'll be glad to take questions. Oh, one other thing, just a reminder that if you would like a free crisis management template, please send your request to the email that's on the screen. It's crisisahead@gmail.com. That's crisisahead@gmail.com. Or if you would like to talk about any of these things that you don't want to share in the Q&A session, feel free to call me on my cell phone, which is 415-218-8600. You might wonder, well, how come Segal's in Washington, D.C. and he has a San Francisco phone number? Well, I love that. I got that phone number a long time ago. It was just random when I got a cell phone. I've loved the number so much. It's followed me across the country. So I really enjoy having that number. So again, if you want to talk, it's 415-218-8600. And now I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Well, first of all, thanks, Edward. I mean, that was great, and I took like 3 pages of notes while you were going, so I appreciated the 1 through 10, and then I thought the way you wrapped it up with the examples was just amazing. So thanks for the presentation. We do have a lot of questions about the pandemic. Tony's asking if it is good to have a pandemic plan included in your business continuity plan.
The short answer and a long answer is yes. And you really need to have a plan in place because as we've seen, we really don't know how long this crisis is going to continue. I remember early on when the pandemic started back in last February or March, people said, oh, it'll be gone in a few days. It'll be gone in a few months. It'll be gone well, it could be a few years, frankly, the way it's being presented and how we're responding to the pandemic. And you really need a crisis management plan in place for this pandemic, because as we've seen with the hundreds of thousands of restaurants and other businesses that have closed, not temporarily, but for good. From a crisis management standpoint, you really need the resources. Well, you need the money, the expertise, whatever it is, to survive the crisis. So yes, you really need a crisis management plan in place as soon as possible for this pandemic, and frankly, for the next pandemic. If there's one thing I've learned, is that there's always going to be a next crisis. There's always going to be something that could disrupt, whether it's the blockage of the Suez Canal or an earthquake or you name it. So yes, have a crisis management plan in place for the pandemic and every other worst case scenario as well.
All right, thank you. Who else has had a question? Alan, I believe your hand's up, and so is the Pitch Freaks.
Thanks, Edward. Your presentation seems to work very well with in the private sector. However, when it comes to the public sector and government, what I've noticed is of your 10 R's, the only R that the government seems to follow is react, and they don't do any of the other 9. And one of our political parties follows a rule of never let a crisis go to waste. And it seems like we continue to get into this. How do you, I'd like a comment on the difference between public sector versus private sector. In the private sector, if you mismanage a crisis, you're going to be held accountable for it. In the public sector, no one's ever held accountable. So how do you react to that?
Well, first, there is some level of accountability in the government, in the public sector. It really depends on the crisis and who's responsible. If there's an elected official that has created a crisis or been involved in crisis, they can face the scrutiny of voters. If there's a crime that created a crisis, then there's possibility of federal or state prosecution by appropriate authorities. But you're right, very few of the 10 R's the government does not seem to respond to. It's all about denial. And denial is not a strategy. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, another R is what was that? You have to recognize that there's a crisis. And for example, what's going on the border right now, our government officially won't even recognize that there's a quote crisis. They call it a challenge. And so how can you deal with a crisis if you won't even recognize that you have one?
There's a difference in my mind between a public recognition of the crisis and a private recognition of a crisis. And when you mix politics, it's a very toxic mixture. And I know we don't have all the time today to get through all of these issues, but I will, having worked for the government myself, for members of Congress. I know they know they know there is a crisis. There's too much
Of course
going
they
on
do.
behind the scenes.
Of
Now,
course
from
they
a
do.
PR standpoint, they don't want to talk about it. But whether they talk about it or not, the crisis is there, and I assure you, they know there is a crisis.
We know that, but don't they have an obligation to inform the public that there's a crisis also?
Well, it's kind of like the elephant in the room. You don't have to say there's an elephant in the room to know there's an elephant in the room. It's something that it's there. We know about it. Whether they want to acknowledge it publicly or use the C word for a crisis, to me, that's a minor issue. I'm more concerned that whatever the crisis is, whatever government, whatever administration, I'm more concerned that they don't sit on their hands, that they don't wish it went away, and that they take whatever appropriate action. And I got to tell you, that's one of the common threads I've found. I've studied past national public health emergencies, and there's a depressing similarity to the crisis, whether it was the flu or Ebola or SARS or polio. The tendency is to ignore it. It's not there. And as time goes on, eventually they have to have a grudging recognition that, okay, maybe we do have a problem, but we're not going to do anything about it. And then later on, time goes by, say, okay, we better do something about it. And then finally, they throw the resources at that problem, at that crisis, and they work like hell to address the crisis. And that's kind of where we are now. But as I said earlier, this national crisis we have is just being prolonged unnecessarily because some of our political leaders are not doing what they need to do to stop the crisis. But that's, again, a longer conversation.
Antonio White has a question as well.
Thank you. A tremendous presentation here. I'm in agreement with Alan. I'm going to come up from a different perspective, though. Is what our good friend General Mike Wyatt talks about is the ground truth of any situation when you're in the midst of battle, and that's probably no bigger crisis than when you're in war on the battlefield, and understanding what the facts are that you're dealing with at the time. And we've had such a difficulty over the last several years just agreeing what the facts are to any particular deal. So depending upon your political bent or what have you, you could simply embrace facts that the other ones don't agree with. But it didn't seem like 10, 15, 20 years ago that we had a argument about the facts. There was some science that we could all agree on, and there may be some slight differentiations between those or disagreements here. But nowadays, it seems as though we can't even agree to a set of facts,
Right.
and that those facts themselves get tied into a political approach one way or the other.
Correct.
And if you're in a crisis here, if the boat's leaking, and one group is saying, well, that leak is because there's a political reason that there's a leak in the boat here, and people can just really just argue about why there's a leak until the boat sinks and everybody dies. Right? That's kind of what I feel what's going on over here now. And when you're in the crisis, one thing that would make a lot of sense in my mind is, how do you determine what the facts are, or from your perspective at least, when you're dealing with risk management, how do you get people to agree to a set of facts so that you can move forward with whatever the situation is that you guys might be dealing with?
It's a great question. Part of my background is as a journalist, and I like to look at any crisis. And when I counsel clients, I look at it through the lens of what would a journalist say? How would they report the story? If your story, your crisis gets reported, how will it look on the front page of a newspaper? And that's a really great exercise to go through. And the clients drop any pretense about, well, what's the facts or what would the New York Times say about it? What would the San Francisco Examiner, what would KGO, what news organizations that they pay attention to, how would they report it? And that's how I look at the lens. And we get we make a lot of progress very shortly. We agree what the facts are, and then we start to deal with the crisis.
Can I have a follow-up to that?
Yes.
So the follow-up I have here is, even because our media is a for-profit media, and media is marketed, right? And marketing has a perspective and a positioning tied to it. And it doesn't matter what type of media it happens to be, radio, newspaper, television, social media, what have you, right? Because as a professional marketer myself, I know that my newspaper is positioned for people who are over 60, or people who are in Silicon Valley, or for people who are very liberal or very conservative or what have you, right? And so I can look at the facts, or I look at the situation overall from a perspective, but then I think about people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, or I think about the situation with Pluto, right? Is Pluto a planet or not? Right? There's a lot of people up in arms about that. And it's like, wow, yeah, forever I thought that Pluto was a planet. So in a way, there's a kind of an astrological crisis, astronomical crisis, right? Is Pluto a planet or not? And then, or things of that nature where we can't even agree on things that have been established, in science for decades and or millennium. And so things like science in particular, you talk about the pandemic. How can we just simply trust the science, and knowing that science changes over time? We learn more, we make new decisions, and sometimes the idea is that we hold scientists to the same level of we hold science in the same regard as a politician with some particular vision and idealism, versus the idea is that scientists are designed to gather data. As they gain more data, decisions can change. It seems like politicians are supposed to just have a decision, and that decision stays the way it is forever, regardless. Otherwise, they're left or right or center or communist or fascist or what have you. And so the challenge here is there's got to be an acceptance for new data over time during the course of a crisis, and the ability for people to absorb, collect, consider, and reevaluate the process, versus simply whatever happened at the beginning should stay through the entire course, regardless of what changes in the dynamics of the crisis. Maybe can you talk about that for a moment?
Sure. Well, as I said a few minutes ago, part of the crisis management plan, part of the 10 R's, when you have a crisis, you need to know the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how. And depending upon the crisis, some of those facts, some of that information may not be immediately available. Depending upon the crisis, the facts are going to change. In the pandemic, we saw where people said, well, we only have 20 deaths and it's going to go away. Well, that didn't happen. People said children aren't going to get it. Well, that wasn't the case. It's a long list of what they said early on about a year ago about the pandemic, that just because they said it, all of a sudden became conventional wisdom. And then it wasn't true because new facts came out, new research, new realities. But to my mind, politicians are probably the least likely to accept reality. Why? Because our political considerations and popularity and a lot of issues about staying in office or getting office or getting elected to office. And politicians are loath to offend anybody. And unfortunately, when dealing with a crisis, you have to offend some people. Sometimes you have to offend everybody. If you want to put the crisis behind you, you have to tell people things that maybe they don't want to hear, they refuse to hear, or does not jive with their reality of of what's happening in the world or their company or their organization. And I got to tell you, that's just as likely to happen in a company as it does with a government. And I have other examples in the book where I talk about how companies denied there was a crisis, despite the fact that there was having a crisis. So things change, but you really have to be open, you have to be objective, and you really have to keep the best interest of your company, your organization, and your role as a leader in that organization. Keep that paramount. What's best for your company, and what's at stake, and what can you do to address that crisis and put it behind you right away? Whether it's government or the private sector, the rules are the same. Whether they follow the rules, well, that's another conversation.
Thank you. It's so much terrific.
Really, really good conversation going on here. I'm keeping an eye on the clock. It's 8:53. I think we have some people that are going to be leaving, but I see Hugh Tuck has his hand up, and then is that to Susan Rowan?
Oh, no, I'm just sitting here taking this all in.
Okay.
Hugh, what about the ransomware teaser?
Good. I wanted to get back to that if time allowed. Just to recap, the crisis scenario that I had outlined was that your company database was hacked. You receive a threatening phone call from someone who claims they are now controlling all of your computer files. They're demanding a $100,000 ransom in Bitcoins. If you don't pay, they'll release information, embarrassing emails written by your staff and directors. So if I was the crisis management consultant and I was called into the company, I would ask the following questions. Did it really happen? There is so much cons and scams going on in the world today that in any crisis, you have to be sure of the facts. And if something is controversial and threatening as ransomware and Bitcoin demands and holding your computer hostage, I have to ask, did it happen? So you'd have to check immediately with your IT consultants or others to make sure whether or not the data has been hacked. So that's step one. If it hasn't been hacked, it's just a con, you call the authorities and you go on. But if it was hacked, then I would ask, do I have a backup? Is all this data available in the cloud or somewhere else? And if I can download it, can I just dismiss the hackers and say, well, too bad, I need to pay you because I've got my data safe in another location. So that would be step two. If it was real, they do have the data and you don't have a backup, you really have to make an important decision. Do I pay or not? And I got to tell you, it's becoming best practices in governments and private sector not to pay. Philadelphia, for example, a couple of years ago, they faced a ransomware situation and they decided not to pay. So you really have to decide going in, is it a real crisis? Is it made up? And if it's real, are you going to pay? And if so, how? The other thing I would do, again, if it's a real crisis and you refuse to pay and they start releasing this information, you got to be prepared to notify everybody ahead of time what's going to happen so they're not surprised. It's best in any crisis that people hear the bad news from you rather than in a news report. So I would reach out and I would notify the people affected by the release of the embarrassing emails, what's going to happen. And importantly, just as I'm telling them, I would apologize. Boy, would I bow deep and often and apologize for what happened and hope they would understand. And you're going to have to live with the consequences. The old rule of thumb is if you don't want to see something bad on the front page of the New York Times, don't do something bad. So if you're afraid of information being leaked, don't write an embarrassing email that would put you in a bad light if it was leaked. And the other piece of advice I would have as their consultant was, what are you going to do to fix this? What are you going to do to prevent this from happening again? Well, from a technology standpoint, to make sure that the data is not hacked. From a policy standpoint, to counsel people, don't write things that you would be embarrassed about if it got released. I would delve deep into the policies and procedures manual of the organization. I would train or retrain the staff about the consequences of embarrassing information being released. And then I would ensure everybody who was affected by the crisis, I would tell them what the company had done to help ensure that the crisis would not be repeated again.
Okay,
Well, Edward, thank you so much. I'm looking at the clock. It's almost 9. So at this point, I'm going to end the recording, but I'd just like to say thank you for joining us and just making this a great meeting today. Great questions, and it's been fantastic.
Great.
So I'm going to go ahead and end the recording, and then I'll keep the room open for a few more minutes if anyone has any further questions. So there you go.